Following video is not going to talk about altering firearms or doing anything else that's a violation of rules on YouTube. We're discussing flare launchers and signaling devices, and yes, I understand that you can, in theory, convert some of these to do real ammunition. That's not what's being discussed here. But I have to touch on that fact because most flare guns and signal pistols and signal launchers and devices use the components that would be used for standard ammunition. This is not a gray area, it's just that it's an unfortunate fact of how they work. And trust me, most companies that make this sort of equipment try to avoid this sort of thing, but economics being the way they are, they're kind of stuck with it. In 1972, Walther Corporation, it's a company that makes pistols and such, put out something called the SP, or signal pistol. This is a double-action, double-barrel signal pistol. It was approved under PTB 1172. 11 may mean that was the 11th certification or permit that was handed out that year, or the month, it doesn't matter. It's a rare signal pistol mentioned only in a book called Walther, a German success story. It's similar to the EMGE 320 Model 5 shock pistol that fired blanks or mace. This one, however, has a lever on it to select one of the two barrels that are centerfire, quote unquote, 16.5 millimeter by 48 millimeter flare based. It was never widely marketed and is very similar to the incompatible M9 15 millimeter rimfire smaller threaded mouth flares. There's very little information about the cartridge. However, a user called Tactical Dad found out that the launcher will also allow you to put in R1/8 caliber 9mm flares that were used in the 1980s AITOR or Mauser survival knife that came with a flare launcher built into it. And also sometimes you could just pull out the flare launcher. They were usually made of plastic, but there's also a metal version, and these were considered minimalist flare launchers. Also, the Umarex Corporation came out with something called the SG, or signal generator. It's a launcher that's almost identical, but it's beefed up to make it easier to hold. Now, I want to point out something really quickly here. The M9 by 15 millimeter rimfire cartridges, you notice that 9, and the 16.5 millimeter by 48 flare, but what flare would work in it? Again, it would allow you to put in 9 millimeter flare, M9, R1/8. Yeah, we're seeing some similarities here. It's almost identical, but the only thing is the threaded end that you screw into it to launch is bigger. And during the 1980s and 1970s, this incompatible flare was either put out by Walther or was put out by some other company. And at the time, at least 2 or 3 flare launchers were come out with. After that, it would have been easy to understand that, if you're not aware of, that the threaded end probably just matched a commonly occurring metric bolt, and people made all sorts of flare launchers, but they weren't officially supported. The flares themselves were available and commonly used, but they were called something else, the R1/8 9 millimeter. Now, we get into the point here where we talk about two things, rimfire and centerfire, which I'm going to discuss in a minute, and the German PTB mark stood for this string of words, which meant Physical and Technical Federal Institute, a testing institute a lot like ANSI in the United States that would do all sorts of standards testing, including for flare launchers, blank firing or alarm signal guns, traumatic pistols, or irritant cartridge weapons. Now, this is very similar to the hunter's signal or pen flare gun design. In fact, it's almost identical, except it's made in a gun shape. Now, there's a problem with this. By definition, any flare gun has to fire through the front. An alarm signal gun or blank firing gun does not have to. So in most countries, they have them fire to the side or the top, not in line with whatever cartridge you're using, because if it is, even partially, even if it's not really going to work, it could be converted. In Britain, something called readily converted firearms or launchers are illegal because people convert them to fire real cartridges, or just use the lifting charge, which is in most cases a blank, to fire a projectile. Now, I'm touching on that, and I'm not telling you to do a modification like that. I'm saying the exact opposite, especially for this one. But I want to point out that's why this gets to be a touchy subject in European Union and in the United States. Now, the thing about this that's strange is you deliberately pick rim or center fire cartridges that are not normally that firing. For instance, most flare launchers use a shotgun primer, a center fire cartridge. But if you make it to where it mechanically chambers for something that looks more like a 45 Colt or whatever, you would make it rim fire instead to make it not compatible. Anyway, let's get to the pictures. This is going to be mostly from Tactical Dad. This is the first image, however. This is the gun that seems to have inspired it. It looks almost exactly like this. And yes, if you're not paying too much attention, that is dead ass a .32 caliber handgun. But it was made for firing blanks or flares by doing a couple of modifications. The easiest modification is to make it to where the bore diameter won't work. The cartridge is a .32 caliber. Well, in this case, could be rimfire or centerfire. It doesn't matter. And whatever cartridge it worked with, what they do is they pick a diameter that makes it to where it won't go through. That's all you had to do in most European Union countries. So what they did is they made them smooth bore and make it 30 caliber or whatever. And make it to where if you put the right cartridge in, it would just blow the damn thing up. But again, that dead ass is a break action double barrel handgun. This is very common. There's also a triple barrel version that's very similar to this. Anyway, this is by RWS, but you get the idea. It's under the EMGE moniker. And again, like I mentioned before, that's very similar to that as far as its pattern and shape. That's Model 5. All the others used a completely different arrangement and would not fire anything like this. And yeah, that does look like an over and under double barrel firearm that you'd find these days as being some sort of self-defense weapon that fires some absurd thing like a 410 shotgun shell. Now let's move on. This is, again, the Tactical Dad webpage. This is the Walther SP right there. And that shows you the mechanism. When you tipped this into the center position, the firing pin would hit in the middle here and hit a soft bumper made out of rubber. And if you tipped it up, it would fire the upper, and tip it down, it would fire the lower one. And it used a really simple, very commonly available linear double action hammer, concealed hammer. We just pop it backwards, and this edge here will be the part that would rock out of the way and let it hit the firing pin, which in this case is most likely a bladed edge looking thing. More appropriate for rim fire. Again, this is supposed to be center fire, but I'm going to bring up why in a minute. This is the other side of it, and there's the PTB 1172 mark, the 16.5 by 48 millimeter cartridge designation, and it says made in Germany. Next we move on. And this is the, quote, center fire mechanism. What? Well, yeah, it's a firing pin slot for it to go up or down so you can hit your center fire position. And they just cut out the rest of it. Okay. Now, again, there are center fire and rim fire lifting charge or blanks that are used to launch these flares. Now, what if you got one that was incompatible, but you could technically screw it in there and you're in a desperate situation? Let's go back and look at that. This has inside of it a detent position, as indicated by that little part there if you're not aware of it, that makes it to where when you click it up, it's all the way up or all the way down. However, you could, if you wanted to, instead of having it be all the way there, in one of the designs, you could push it further to hit the rim on top by pushing it further over by straining it or even damaging it, and the other way around. Or you could just push it halfway. Let's go back and look at that. Again, The centerfire position's here, but if you don't push it all the way, it would hit the rim of a cartridge. While this was sold as a centerfire only launcher, if you manipulate that and not have it in the detent position, it might still let you get away with, quote unquote, launching an emergency flare in an emergency situation that you shouldn't have had possession of. If you're not aware of it, in many countries, rim-fire blank launchers are regulated heavily because they'll fire 22 short, and 22 long rifle, and 22 magnum. And it's pretty trivial for you to make a barrel that screws in here and actually fires a real cartridge. And because this has the ability to fire 2 shots, they would have been encouraged to make sure it was not rim fire. But, again, I have to emphasize this. The threads are plastic. The entire front here has a plastic buffer or a rubber buffer on it. So it wouldn't really fire a cartridge well. But again, in an emergency, you could. Now, why would someone enable that? This could have been sold in other countries, like in Africa or South America, where it's legal for you to fire, quote, emergency ammunition. Basically 22 short only. It would have a little 22 short barrel, or 2 of them, and would let you fire twice for acquiring game. Some countries do not allow that. But flare guns adapted that way are not illegal everywhere. And in fact, in the United States, it's technically not illegal to do that. Now I want to bring up, because this used a proprietary cartridge, at least it's supposed to be, but the cartridges were essentially reverse engineered and sold all over the place for at least 2 other launchers. It's very likely that this one was a model that was deliberately made to where it could fire rim fire or center fire, so you could actually fire the incompatible cartridges as long as it's squeeze fit in. And because it's plastic, you could probably force it in by screwing it in or gluing it in or whatever. And this was probably done with a wink and a nod to the standards group, because having a flare launcher in an emergency that won't fire because it's proprietary and some company decided not to let it fire is not acceptable. So obviously you'd switch it to the center fire position, try to fire it, and then slightly move it to the other position because it's an emergency to fire whatever flare cartridge you could get. You could physically push in the rimfire ones and just move the thing out of the way. It would have been a pain in the ass, but if it's an emergency, no one's going to fault you for it. It would be technically considered misuse of a flare gun. The United States also has a similar rule, but again, in an emergency, or if you do it in a way that's legal, because there is a legal way to do it in some countries, like in the United States, for instance, it would not be a felony or anything to get you in trouble. Again, this depends on what area you're in, whether you're on public land, federal land, out at sea, you get the idea. And yes, this is the, quote, R1/8 or R1/8 9mm format. It has nothing to do with 9mm cartridges. It just means it was meant to fit into, if you're not aware of it, a blank firing gun that's called a 9mm gun. It used 9mm blanks. Yeah, 9mm rimfire, otherwise known as garden gun. So yeah, again, readily convertible by British standards. This thing would have had a lot of restrictions on it. So to make it not restricted, they would have made it center fire. But again, like I said, in an emergency, that's a shitty excuse for not getting rescued. You could slowly kind of increment over and actually fire the rimfire cartridges. So this is an example of a proprietary design by law that was made for safety reasons and for, honestly, for humanitarian reasons, not requiring that you follow the law and be able to fire rim fire or center fire blank-driven flares. Anyway, that's it for the Walther SP, or signal pistol, from 1972 that went on a short run and used a, quote, proprietary cartridge that was eventually reverse engineered into a slightly less proprietary cartridge all the way into the 1980s for Umarex and also for Mauser. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. And this has been a rare or weird flare gun video by Waptec.